Okay, and sure. Take a moment. All right, Elliot, are we good? Okay. All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight. And I want to thank Jen very much. Not everyone has met Jen. Now she's just on the other side of that door. Jen was our phantom employee during much of COVID, running our Chevra program, and then going on maternity leave, and then returning. And now we finally get to meet her in person. Enthusiastic, competent, wonderful in every way. I very rarely, as you know, if ever, kind of read off prepared written remarks. Are we able to close that door? Thank you. Just to, okay, because we're on Pico Boulevard still. Thank you, Ethan. Okay, but I wanted to introduce tonight from my prepared written remarks because language is very, very important, and I wanted to choose my words carefully because to some degree, they will frame the experience that we're going to have tonight and over the next couple of months. I'm even going to put my glasses on so I can read my carefully prepared remarks. Okay. While I do not presume to speak for everyone here, I will, with a high level of confidence, describe our community as passionately Zionist. This passion grows out of our religious faith, our deep consciousness of Jewish history generally, and of the Shoah in particular, and of our personal experiences witnessing the miracle of the Jewish state. This passion expresses itself in the ways that we meticulously follow Israeli news, celebrate holidays and life cycle events in Israel, provide Israel experiences for our children during and after their high school years, celebrate with Israel in happy times, and worry about and grieve with Israel in more difficult times. Woven into the fabric of this passion, there is also a deep concern about the ways in which Israel's reality falls short of the vision expressed in the most significant Jewish document of modern times, Israel's Declaration of Independence. While the reasons are invariably complex, the fact is that neither the envisioned equality among Israel's citizens nor the state of peace with its neighbors, in particular with the Palestinian neighbors, has been realized. And alongside our passionate Zionism, we have also come to realize that Israel is not blameless in these failures and that we cannot simply pretend that we don't see them. The three-part series that we begin tonight and will continue on December 12th and culminate on January 30th is a direct result of the commitment that we made this past summer to go beyond simply acknowledging our thoughts and feelings to doing the work that would enable us to articulate a Zionism that continues to be proud and vibrant and simultaneously aware of and engaged with the complexities that are today's state of Israel. I want to thank the members of the working group who conceptualized and planned this program with me: Howie Wetstein, Mina Rush, Zev Horowitz, Joanne Halperin, and Nikki Seeger. One of the first decisions that we made was that we needed to begin with an understanding of the parallel narratives, meaning how the great dates in Zionist and Israeli history were experienced not only by the world Jewish community, but also by the Arab-Palestinian community, who would not characterize these as great dates at all. We are privileged tonight to have as our guest Dr. Hussein Ibish, who you see on the screen, who is as excited to be with us as we are to be with him. So excited, in fact, that he is here on Eastern Standard Time, for which we thank him. Dr. Ibish frequently partners with Jewish colleagues to talk and teach about Israel and Palestine. He is a senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, a weekly columnist for Bloomberg, and a regular contributor to many other U.S. and Middle Eastern publications. His most recent book is entitled What's Wrong with the One-State Agenda? Why Ending the Occupation and Peace with Israel is Still the Palestinian National Goal. He previously served as senior fellow at the American Task Force on Palestine, and I also noticed from his bio that he and I are exactly the same age, and I know that he is recovering from knee replacement surgery, which I'm trying to prevent from making me nervous. We, of course, Dr. Ibish, join in wishing you a refuah shlema, a complete and speedy recovery. So tonight we'll be roughly splitting an hour between Dr. Ibish's remarks and Q&A that is no less important for our purposes tonight. Because we're hooked up via Zoom, the only way we could really figure out to do the Q&A efficiently is to ask you to jot down questions that you have on the index cards that you picked up. You can start doing so at whatever point you'd like. Either Jen or I or both will collect those cards as Dr. Ibish addresses us. And when he is done, I'll relay the questions to him, and he'll be able to answer the questions that we have. After the Q&A, we'll have some just internal time to discuss our thoughts and reactions among ourselves. And without any further ado, we welcome Dr. Hussein Ibish.
Thank you very much. It's great to be with you tonight, and I think you're to be congratulated on being willing to reach out, beyond your comfort zones and to listen to other perspectives on historical events that are very important to you, but that maybe have been experienced differently by others. So I think that's a great thing. It's not the usual thing, and it's very commendable. So thank you very much for letting me be part of that. This is the first time I've been in a chair for a prolonged period of time in 2 weeks. So if I squirm around a bit and look sort of uncomfortable, that's why, because I kind of am, but it's really good for me. So anyway, what I'm going to do is try to explain the way in which key moments in the development of the Zionist movement and then the state of Israel were experienced by Palestinians. And I'm going to just go through a simple chronology, beginning with the first Zionist Congress in Basel in Switzerland in 1897, and come up to the present day and try, as briefly as I can, maybe in half an hour or so to leave plenty of time for Q&A, what it is that informs the Palestinian national narrative. I mean, who do they think they are? What do they think they've been through? And what animates them? What do they want? And I think it all kind of unspurls itself very evidently if you're willing to accept that these, in fact, were their experiences. All right, so let's just begin then at the beginning, because I think it's fair to say that while in the West in particular, especially the United States, a land of little historical memory, it's often presumed that this is an age-old conflict. I don't think it's possible to really root the Israeli-Palestinian or the Arab-Israeli or anything to do with the modern state of Israel before 1897. There were dreams, there were fantasies, yearnings, desires, urgings, whether religious or otherwise, including among some Christians in the 19th century, even the 18th century, Napoleon and whatnot. But until the first Zionist Congress, there's no, or that is, say, at the end of the 19th century, there's no political movement to accomplish that. There's no agenda to put it into practice in any way. And I think that's the moment when Jewish nationalism in the form of Zionism becomes a thing. All right, a practical program. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And so before that, you just don't have any of the elements of the conflict as far as I'm concerned. And I think it's really important to understand that at the time of the first Zionist Congress, the notion of Zionism was sort of unimaginable to the Palestinians, who didn't, at that point, didn't even conceive of themselves as Palestinians. When the Congress met in committee in Switzerland, and from a Palestinian point of view, they would say, decided to replace the people of the land with themselves and or their brethren. That is how it looks from a Palestinian point of view. I can understand it looks very different from a Jewish point of view, particularly in light of pogroms and the Holocaust and anti-Semitism that drove Zionism at the time. But that's how I think Palestinians looking back on it experience it, that some Jewish Europeans met in committee and decided they should be the people of the land and not the people who live there. And that's how it looks like. But at the time, it didn't look like that. It didn't really look like anything. As Zionism got going, between the First Congress and the Balfour Declaration in 1917, forgive me, the sense of Arab nationalism opposing the Ottoman Empire, an ethnic nationalism, which began really among Arab Christians, trying to find a sort of a non-Islamic and non-Turkish way of organizing their societies, which they could fully participate in as Arabs who were not necessarily Muslim and didn't have much connection to Turkey, as nobody really particularly did. But it seemed to them a way out of the kind of Islamically defined entity. And it went well with European-inspired ethno-nationalism, right? Because everyone agreed there was Arab as anybody else. They just happened to be Christian. So in other words, if you remove religion from the political equation by prompting Arab nationalism defined by ethnicity and not by religion, it sounds better to Arab Christians. But it caught on. It was very, very popular, including among most of the Arab Muslims. But that doesn't mean that the people of Palestine, including the intellectuals and the urban bourgeoisie and the wealthy landowners, of the people who are really educated, of which there are quite a few, but obviously not the majority, had not yet fully incorporated necessarily, and certainly had not started to see themselves as a distinct Palestinian, a national group. In the period between 1897 and 1917, though, you did start to get prominent Arabs from Palestine in the Ottoman parliament, such as it was. It did exist. It wasn't particularly in power, but it existed. And other prominent people from the Husseini clan and other clans corresponding with making speeches in the Ottoman parliament about their concern about this movement and where it was going. And some very important correspondences between, various Zionist leaders and some prominent Palestinians via third parties in some cases, in which they basically said, we're here, be very careful what you're doing here. So while we're in this intermediate period, I just want to pose a set of questions that I probably should have begun with, and I just want to do it quickly now. Who are the Palestinians? They are the Muslim and Christian Arab, although there were also Jews among them until this division between Palestinian and Israeli in the population of Palestine, sort of the original inhabitants around the time of the birth of the Zionist movement. And while the Jewish inhabitants tended generally to become Israelis, the Arab Muslims and Christians didn't, generally not. And there's obviously a great complexity when it comes to the Arab citizens of Israel, but in general, they do tend to see themselves as Palestinians, and these are the Palestinian people. It is before that, during this inchoate period, between 1897 and 1917, these are a people who are very variegated between a very small landowning, kind of almost feudal minority of wealthy people, a great mass of peasants who farmed either their own land or someone else's land for a living, and a relatively small but growing sort of urban group, not really a proletariat, but a bourgeoisie, doctors, lawyers, Indian chiefs, what have you, all of professionals who existed in the cities that were growing, throughout the country at the time. So it's very important to understand that, most of the Palestinians at the time, or proto-Palestinians, I think we should call them, were peasants. They were not particularly informed. They were not particularly engaged. And one of the biggest differences between the Palestinians of the pre-Israeli state era and the Yishuv, the Jewish community. Now, apart from the Jews who were originally there, it was a very tiny percentage of the Jewish community. The Jewish community, the Zionist emigres, or those who came to Palestine, for the most part, were a self-selected group, you see. And that's a big difference. So, in other words, this whole experience is something that most of the Jewish participants in it between 1897 and 1948 signed up for. They thought it was a good idea, they wanted to do it. Palestinians experienced it in a much more passive way. They were there, and it happened. And at no point in their history, I would argue even until this day, have they been fully ready for it, because it's something they've reacted to. Right? It's not something that they proactively created. That's exceptionally important to understand. There is then, in this period, a sense of budding Arab nationalism, but not a consciousness of Palestinian nationalism yet. But there is also a growing sense, as Jewish communities grow, and as the basic notion of Zionism begins to solidify around the idea of a Jewish or Jewish-dominated or Jewish majority, or in some way Jewish nation-state in this country that is still overwhelmingly, I mean, when we're talking about 1920, you're talking about over 95% Arab. And it's a bit of a shock to hear this. It seems ridiculous. It seems kind of absurd, yet it's happening. And so the idea starts to filter through eventually in a very kind of gradual way. And opposition begins to solidify. I just want to point out, before we get into this, one other really crucial thing. We who grew up, since 1948, and I assume almost everybody in this room did. I mean, I certainly did. And the rabbi did, since we're the same age. We tend to think of these concepts, these words, Israeli-Palestinian, or Israeli and Arab, but especially Israeli and Palestinian, as these kind of baked in identities that are, essential and inherent and enduring. And that these are very well-defined, fixed received ideas. Who is an Israeli, who's a Palestinian? That this is very old and very well-defined. That's not true at all. And when my father was born in the 1920s, there was no such thing as an Israeli. It didn't mean anything. If you said Israeli, what is, they would have a sense you're talking about Israel, but then they would have wondered why you're bringing up, the Bible, and it just really wouldn't have meant anything at all. Palestinian had a meaning in the 1920s and 1930s, but it didn't refer, usually almost never really, to the Arab citizens of the British Mandate of Palestine, right? It now does. The people it now does refer to. It meant British institutions in Mandatory Palestine, or other entities in Palestine, the Palestine Post, which is now the Jerusalem Post, the Palestine Police, the British Police Force, etc. So it was just entities and organizations in Mandatory British Palestine, but mostly British, could be Jewish, could be Arab, could be whatever. And it certainly did not refer to the Arab citizens. So these words are ones that have taken on their present meaning in the lifetimes of many people who are living today. In my parents' lifetimes, for example. You don't have to be a terribly decrepit person necessarily to have watched these words go from either meaning nothing at all or meaning something very different to meaning what today seems intractable, unavoidable, etc. All right, so back to and I think it's very important, very, very important to keep that in mind, because we really are, in the end, talking about human beings who cathect to their identities because of historical experiences, beliefs, shared narratives, etc. There's nothing inherent about any of this. People, they're born into it, but they're born into it culturally, not physiologically. There's nothing baked in here. And I'm a very big believer in that. And I think that's simply a historical fact, where we could debate it. I think one of the key turning points in the Palestinian experience that is not shared by any version of Zionist and Jewish history, modern Jewish history, but that you should really understand because it's so crucial to the emergence of Palestinian nationalism, is something you all may not even know about. It's the defeat of Emir Faisal, the Hijazi prince who was aligned with Lawrence of Arabia in World War I. And he came to Damascus, as bizarrely depicted in that wonderful, entirely fictional film of David Lean with Peter O'Toole. It's a great movie. It bears no resemblance to anything that really happened, but that's okay. But it is true that Faisal ended up routing the Ottomans along with the Allies, and ended up in Damascus before any of the Allies, and set up a pan-Arab state, a pan-Syrian state in Damascus in 1919 and beginning of 1920. And I think those Palestinians, those Arabs in Palestine, there's no mandate yet, right? It's the end of World War I. The League of Nations has not set up a mandate yet. But those Arabs there in what was about to become mandatory Palestine, I think insofar as they had political thoughts, almost entirely identified with the pan-Arab state based in Damascus. I think they saw themselves as Southern Syrians. It's really important to understand that in the Arab world, there are distinct cultural blocks. And there's a block which can be, and often is called Shami, meaning Bilad Sham, the lands of Damascus, the areas surrounding Damascus. And in these areas, people speak roughly the same kind of Arabic. They eat roughly the same kind of food, hummus, tabbouleh, fattoush, kibbe, these things, right? And all the Palestinian foods that have become, in some cases, Israeli foods as well. But all that stuff, which is not what people necessarily eat in Iraq and Saudi Arabia and Egypt, et cetera. In some cases, yes, but in many cases, no. They have the same dances, the debki and these kind of, same musical instruments. There are lots of local variations, but the basic sort of way of being Arab is the same. So it's not, if you start thinking of nationalism in European terms as cultural blocks of people who speak and eat and think and dance and act roughly in the same way, in ways that are mutually intelligible instantaneously and require no translation despite regional variations, sort of on the model of France or even Italy, maybe to some extent England, what have you, those kind of communities and nations based on those kind of ideas, as you see expressed in kind of the breakup of Yugoslavia, where they tried to do that, even in places like Bosnia, where there was no good way of dividing, but in some cases, like between Croats and Slovenes and Serbs, there was. So this is sort of the model of European nationalism. Riffing off of that, it becomes obvious to the Arabs of Bilad al-Sham, of Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and much of Jordan, definitely not all of it, but sort of the West Bank and the northern part of Jordan, yes. That this is a natural Arab state, right? If it isn't going to be from Morocco to Iraq with all the Arabs, at least it will be, in this greater Syrian region. And I think Palestinians were clearly invested emotionally in that. They saw themselves as part of that and did not have any sense of Palestinian national identity. But that state was crushed by the French in 1920. And that's the moment when the Arabs of what was about to become Palestine, I mean, it's Palestine historiographically, there was a concept of the area of Palestine, but it was not a legal area yet, that entered into the mandate in 1922. They're on their own. They're not gonna be able to look to Damascus or Beirut or Riyadh or anywhere or Cairo, Baghdad, anywhere. Nothing's gonna help them. And that the colonialists are in full control, and that they need to do for themselves. And it's after that that you really start to see a Palestinian national identity, distinct from a pan-Arab identity, or previously any kind of pan-Islamic or pan-Christian or anything like that identity, which is generations gone at this point, or even a pan-Syrian or like this Levantine identity. It's all gone as a matter of pragmatism, right? It may be it's still a dream for many people, but they realize that's not happening to them. So the League of obviously the Balfour Declaration is kind of the crucial moment in the history of the Israeli state, and it's celebrated as a commitment by the preeminent power in the world to create a national home for the Jewish people. It doesn't say a state; it's ambiguous about that, but it does take the overwhelming majority of the people of Palestine, and it does of this new territory they're talking about, and reduces them in two ways. First, it calls them existing non-Jewish communities. Now, if you can imagine 95% of a country being called the non-5%, that is a pretty remarkable thing to have happen to you. It's sort of like you're immediately the appendage, even though you're almost everyone there. It becomes quite remarkable. The second thing is that while it doesn't promise Jews a state explicitly, even arguably implicitly, because what does a national home mean? It could mean a lot of things. Could certainly mean a state, could mean a refuge, could mean, who knows? There are all kinds of ways of interpreting it, but it does imbue the Jewish people with a national identity and national rights. You can't have a national home without being a national group, and you can't have a national home without having national rights. I mean, those are obviously, it flows. If you're a national group, you have national rights. That's it. The existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, not only are they undefined in any way, nothing, they're negated. They're not Jewish. That's what they are, and that's all that counts about them, is that they're not Jewish. The other thing is they have civic and religious rights. In other words, individual rights. They don't have any collective rights. The Jews, implicit, it's not even implicit, it's explicit in the Balfour Declaration. They have national rights because they are a national group who need a national home. Palestinians are guaranteed existing civic and religious rights, which are individual rights. You have civil rights, I have civil rights. You have a religious right, I have religious rights. Fine, but you may have national rights and I may not have national rights, and that's there in the Balfour Declaration, and that I think is still the reality that exists today. Jumping forward, there is, by the way, if you want to talk about Jordan, there is this, I would say, a myth in the Jewish community that Jordan was part of the mandate and it was yanked away from Israel, and therefore that. You need to understand, Jordan was part of the Palestine mandate for about 8 weeks. Okay, it is not untrue, but it is sophistry to suggest that there was some kind of injustice done there. It wasn't ratified even. So I mean, we can talk about it if you like, but it's a very misleading. It's a lawyerly Clintonian thing. It depends what the meaning of the word is. It's not really a reasonable point. 1948, obviously, now we can speak of the real historical parallels between the modern Jewish narrative post-Holocaust and the modern Palestinian narrative post-48 as being mirror images of each other. This is really important. These narratives are so similar, but they have different outcomes. And I want to say at the beginning, let me explain what I mean. What I mean here is they're narratives of a people who did nothing to deserve their fate, who experienced a great catastrophe, and then what? And then in the Israeli narrative, there's this redemption, which the rabbi referred to. He expressed it very eloquently. And I think this is a widely shared point of view in not only among Jews, but among many people in the West. Many people in the world see this as a tale of redemption. Fine. From the Palestinian point of view, it's the tale of an unending catastrophe. And I'll try to explain what I mean by that. Now, I'm not trying, it really needs to be said, I'm not trying to equate the Holocaust and genocide, industrial mass murder, with mass displacement and mass dispossession. These are not equal fates. It is much better to be kicked out and not allowed to come home than to be gassed and burned. And there's no doubt about it. And the scale is also different. You're talking about almost 800,000 people displaced in one side, and at least 6 million, if not more, on the other side. So there's no parallelism in terms of enormity, but there is in terms of trauma, and that's the crucial thing. So you have these two wounded peoples. One may be more wounded than the other or whatnot. It's not important. The point is they are traumatized peoples, and that's very important for understanding. It's one of the reasons why it's been so hard to come to terms. The other main reason is the asymmetry of power, I would argue. There's no real pressure on Israel to make concessions that are painful, and especially given that Israel is, for its Jewish citizens in particular, a democracy, that these politicians have to respond to their voters. And it's very hard for them to make the case that they should give up things that a substantial minority wants to, or even a majority wants to hold on to. And can hold on to. That's the crucial thing, and can hold on to. So you're asking people to do something that human beings don't really do, which is, and I'm talking here about Israelis who are being asked to make a two-state solution. They're being asked to give up things that they really, 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 really want, when they don't actually have to do that. And that's something human beings don't generally do. The same applies to the Palestinians when it came to partition plans in 1947 and 1948. The UN partitioned Palestine, as you know, and divided it in this weird gerrymandered way to include in a Jewish state, which was going to be about 55% of the territory and most of the good stuff, not the desert. The maximum number of Jews and the minimum number of Palestinians, which would have ended up with about 50-50. In other words, the proposed Jewish state would not even have really had a Jewish majority, but a Jewish plurality, and then in the rest of the country, an Arab state with virtually no Jews in it. And looking back, obviously, Palestinians made a big mistake by not accepting it, but I would argue that no people in that situation would ever have accepted the division of their country like that. Now, if they'd been, if they'd had the benefit of hindsight, if they had foresight, if they'd been a single individual rather than millions of people, they might have been able to do it. But most people don't have foresight, and I don't certainly ever have foresight. And collectivities just don't act that way. And then the same way that Israelis now, I think, are finding it almost impossible to make the kind of concessions that would lead to a two-state solution, I think Palestinians found the idea of partition just impossible to accept as a kind of bizarre injustice that just made no sense. You've got a country that's 75% majority that doesn't want anything to do with breaking it up. It's a small country, and you're saying you have to give it up anyway, and that to more than half of it. And this just didn't sit, and that's sort of the way it was. I don't want to spend too much more time on the basic facts, but obviously, the crucial thing about 1948 is whatever historical narrative you accept about blame and who did what to whom and all that, although the historical facts are not really disputed. Motivation is disputed, intention is disputed, but among serious historians, there's almost no dispute about who did what when. Why is disputed, but the actual facts are really not in dispute, particularly among honest historians, which is almost all serious historians. So that's an interesting point, I think, and it's something that my Jewish colleagues like Dave Myers of UCLA and others and I begin with. We're going to be honest about the facts. Right? We're not going to trim the facts to suit our narratives. Where the facts collide with our narratives, we're going to admit the narratives are just self-serving rationalizations, falsehoods, propaganda, whatever you want to call it. Self-deceit, self-delusion. Okay. The basic fact for Palestinians is before 1948, there was an inchoate country that was a post-colonial society, was struggling to come up to terms with modernity, just like all the societies in Asia and Africa, except Japan. Japan is the lone example in Asia and Africa of a country that modernized, in a generation. Everyone else struggled with modernity, struggled with colonialism, struggled with these ideas. With greater or lesser success over time. Many are still struggling. It's natural. But they were a coherent society that existed with institutions and with everything that makes up a society. And with it was there. And a few months later, it was gone. There were still people, especially in the Galilee, who were not expelled. There were still some people in a few cities and towns. There was still the West Bank, but the society of the Palestinian Arabs was gone, never to return. And that's why the Palestinians vanished from history in 1948. They vanished because the overwhelming majority of them were displaced. They fled or they were forced out. Almost none of them were allowed to return on pain of being shot, and almost none of them did return. When they left, the refugees, and I've met so many of them in my life, and they all say the same thing. When we left, we thought we were just getting out of the way of a war and we'd be back. They took their keys. That's why the key is one of the biggest symbols of Palestinian nationalism, because they all thought they were going back to their homes. But between 49 and 54, the land was expropriated through various acts, and the villages were either changed or bulldozed, about 550 of them, and the places to which Palestinians intend to return were gone or changed irrevocably, and the ownership absolutely removed, by the late 50s, and the whole thing became an impossible dream. This was underscored but they had, I lost my thread. They vanished from history because they lost their national institutions. There was an Arab uprising in the 30s, which broke a lot of their institutions, the political groups, but it really was in 48 that scattered to the winds, Palestinians kind of turned inward in their families, became fixated on education because that's all their children had to survive with. And they didn't have any national institutions until after the 1967 war. Yes, the PLO was founded in 68, and there were other groups before, in 64, and other groups were formed before that. But it's not until after 1967, the rise of Fatah and Yasser Arafat, that the Palestinians begin to express themselves nationally in any kind of an independent way. So that's 20 years off the stage of history, totally off the stage of history, used as a prop by all kinds of people, but especially Arab regimes, but not in any way speaking for themselves or making decisions or in any way involved. The PLO for its first few years was just an Egyptian, a puppet or entity, a hollow entity. But the defeat in 1967 made two things very clear. The Arab states were not going to be able to defeat Israel. So Palestinians, again, told, you're on your own, guys. And second thing is that 48 is not reversible, right? Because between 48 and 67, the dream of Palestinians, maybe foolishly, but also I would say naturally from a human point of view, was, my God, we've been kicked out. Our land has been taken. We have to reverse this. We have to change this. That was a few years ago. And then 5 years go by, 10 years go by, 15 years go by, 20 years go by. Almost everyone who's grown up can remember this. And so they're not really willing to give up the dream. In 67, it became clear that this dream is not going to work. And in 73, it became very clear. It became clear to Israelis that they had to make a deal with the Egyptians, that they were actually in danger of future wars, that this is not necessarily going to be 67 every time. They could be very, very, very dangerous. And that Arab armies were not necessarily pathetic. But it also told the Palestinians that there's no reversing, as 67 did, that there's no reversing 1948. So I'm going to cut to the chase because I want to finish here. Over about 10 to 15 years, Palestinians convinced themselves to accept a two-state solution. The PLO made this transition. It was difficult, it was painful, many people didn't like it, but it became a Palestinian consensus. And in Oslo, they thought they were beginning that process. And we got this situation of Palestinian self-rule in Area A and a little bit of authority in Area B, and then you have Area C in the West Bank. And that was in force, by 1994. 95. And that's where we've been ever since. And there's been no movement ever since. And we can talk about who's to blame and who did what to whom, and it's your fault, it's my fault, it's the other fault. But here's the reality from a Palestinian point of view. These are people who've been displaced or occupied, right? That they've lost their society, basically. A society they had. Now they have others, but they feel very much, especially the lack of citizenship. The only big group of Palestinians that have citizenship are the Palestinians in Jordan who have citizenship. It's the biggest group of refugees outside of Eretz Israel, outside of Israel and the occupied territories. It's in Jordan, and they have citizenship. In Lebanon, there's a few 100,000 don't have citizenship. In Syria, beleaguered, murdered, etc., don't have citizenship. In Israel, there are a lot of Palestinians who have citizenship, but it's heavily defined, especially by the nation-state law and by the fact of being a minority. The Palestinians who live in the occupied territories do not have citizenship in Israel nor any other state, and they are the biggest group of non-citizens in the world, and the only group of people who are not, mainly not refugees, who are not citizens of any country. There are lots of peoples who are second-class citizens or beleaguered citizens of tyrannical dictatorships or monarchies or communist regimes around the world, and Tibetans and who knows who suffer. But all of them at least are theoretically citizens of the country in which they live and have paths, potentially, at least in theory, to gaining access to some kind of input, right? If they play by the rules, whatever it might be. This does not exist for Palestinians, right? In the occupied territories, by far the biggest group in the world. They are outside the whale in a world entirely defined by citizens and states with rights and responsibilities, even of tyrannies and dictatorships and absolute monarchies. They are pretty unique. And when I meet Palestinians, there are all these dreams about historical narratives and restoring this and restoring that, and it's dream. What do they really want? I bring that, and it's dream. What do they really want? I find invariably what they want is citizenship. What they want is to be citizens. They want to have a passport. They want to have a country, not necessarily even their own country, but a country. And this, I think, is at the heart of why this conflict remains so volatile, because they don't, and there's no pathway for them to do it. And there's no prospect they're going to get that, neither as part of a broader Israeli-Palestinian entity, or as part of Israel, or as an independent state, or as an anything. And that's something I don't think any group of millions of people are going to really tolerate into the indefinite future. They won't. That's not how people are. Anyway, I'll stop with that. And obviously, I've left out an enormous amount of stuff. So whatever you want to talk about is fine. But I think I've given you some outline of the experience.
Am I on? Oh, I'm on. Okay. First of all, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for laying it out there for us in such a clear and articulate way and giving us a lot to think about. I do have
absolutely welcome.
What?
I said you're welcome.
Oh, right, we have like a 3-second delay, so okay.
I understand.
Okay, so I do have a couple of questions. I'm going to, as I read through them, I'll just start with one question. This is my question, and then I'll read through everyone's question. One of the things that we hear a lot about, or continue to hear a lot about, is the Palestinian right of return. And reflecting on just the last few minutes of what you said, what are we to make? I mean, in other words, often Jews and Israelis will take the right of return as a very serious claim and a frightening one. And
it is.
You're telling us that it's not really, it's really a fiction.
Okay, it is and it isn't, right? Okay. I think it's something that all Palestinians believe they're entitled to. And they have a very strong body of international law to kind of make that case in a debating society. But the world is not a debating society, right? I think it's been clear from the outset that the Israeli state was constructed to produce as much as possible a Jewish majority. And that was not going to be voluntarily given up because somebody has a good legal argument, right? So I think it's something that the Palestinians who are responsible for speaking for the Palestinian movement, and by the way, I mean, despite the existence of Hamas, there is no question, and Hamas does not dispute this, that the PLO speaks for the Palestinians diplomatically. That even they admit that. They complain about the PLO, they're not part of the PLO, they gripe about it, they hate it, whatever, they love it, they hate it, whatever it is. But even they admit it has the authority. The Palestinian negotiators who started talking to the Israelis back in Oslo in 91, 92, secretly, and then made the deal, they knew that the right of return was something that would have to be dealt with in a creative way. There's not going to be a mass return of Palestinian refugees to Israel. The whole essence of a two-state solution is two states for two peoples, with maybe with minorities in both, or either state, or whatever people want. But it's just not realistic to expect Israelis to say, well, you won the moral argument, therefore we're going to give up the state, or we're going to, give up our majority. That's not going to happen. So they understood that. What was needed was a way of acknowledging the right without enforcing the return. And the idea was, and they came very close to agreeing on numbers in Taba, when the first Intifada was going on in December of 2000, even January 2001. They came very close to a number. And the number would have been a number of Palestinians, however many thousands, 5,000, 10,000, 20,000, over a certain number of years in batches, who would be returned from a Palestinian point of view, implementing the right of return in a small symbolic way, but doing it. From an Israeli point of view, family repatriation, and that Israel would have the final say, because the sovereign state, over who gets to participate and who doesn't and where they can go. Okay, fine. And that there would be some kind of acknowledgement on both sides about how bad this was. And that would take care of it. And I think during the heyday of the two-state solution in the 90s, that would have been entirely saleable to Palestinians. And I still think it's saleable to Palestinians in the context of a real two-state solution. Not because I like it, but because they really need to get past it, and they know very well that this is something they're convinced they have a right to, but they can't yet. So the question then becomes, you can have this basket of goodies, or you can have, which doesn't include a lot of things you think you deserve and want and need and ought to have, or you can have nothing. They'll take the basket if the basket is minimally okay. And I think that's where we are right now. I will say this. There are a lot of times when Palestinians talk up the right of return, either because it's very popular and it gets them, applause in their community, right? So there's always outbidding and nationalism and what have you, everywhere. And the other thing is Palestinians have, and I certainly did in the 90s, try to build up the right of return as a bargaining chip. Right. I wrote a paper about it before the second Intifada, sort of making the case that it was very important, not saying that it has to happen, but that Israel's absolute no can't be the last word, and there needs to be a huge negotiation on this, basically suggesting a deal about effectively giving up the implementation of the right of return in exchange, in effect, for a Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem. Not necessarily dividing the city, but opening the eastern part to house the Palestinian capital. Those days are over. So I don't know where we go with this, but I would say that it's less scary than it seems, in my opinion.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Jen. Okay. Oh, that was Howie's question too. All right. So we give Howie. Okay, we think alike. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. I think this is a question you may have answered. I want to honor the question.
Go ahead.
What are the concessions on Israel's part that right now would lead to a two-state solution?
Well, right now it's very hard to imagine how you do it. But I think the most important thing the Israeli state could do, which it has never done, is replicate the gesture of the PLO in 1993 at the beginning of the Oslo process. The whole Israeli-Palestinian diplomatic dialogue begins with an exchange of letters. They're called the letters of mutual recognition. The first letter of mutual recognition, and this is the document of Israeli-Palestinian diplomacy, is a letter from Yasser Arafat in his capacity as chairman of the PLO to Itzhak Rabin, in which on behalf of the PLO and therefore the Palestinian people, he recognizes the state of Israel and its right to exist in peace and freedom and free from threats and terror and attack and all of that. In return, Rabin, in his capacity as the prime minister of the state of Israel, sent Arafat a letter recognizing the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people and undertaking to negotiate with it. So there's, in terms of a two-state solution, there's a pretty strong asymmetry there. Insofar as the representatives of the Palestinians have recognized Israel since 1993, unequivocally. Now, rhetorically, they all say all kinds of things, but that's the document that bears their signature, and they've never revoked it or done anything formally to renege on it. And they won't, for now. If they can help it, they won't. It's necessary for everything they've achieved, all right? Whatever, however limited and frustrating it is. What the Israeli state could do is recognize the Palestinian right to a state and commit to creating a fully independent Palestinian state along the lines of 1967 with mutually agreed landswaps. If the Israeli state put that in writing, it would be revolutionary. That has absolutely never happened. You can make the case that it's implicit in Oslo. It certainly seems implicit in the basic agreements in 1993, but it's never been said. The Israeli state has never committed to any such a thing. And I think just even that commitment would be a Copernican change in the dynamic.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay. The next question. How do we get two peoples who both experience trauma and thus want justice to move beyond trauma and justice to compromise? That's a good question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's a mass psychology question, and it's very hard to do that. I mean, I guess there are two ways of looking at it. A realpolitik point of view would say people have to be forced to make those concessions. People have to be forced to allow others their rights, and right now, I think the biggest reason we have, been stuck for so many decades is that there really isn't any major pressure on the state of Israel to make the concessions that so many Israelis would find so painful, given the historical and religious significance of so much of the territory in the West Bank. It's not like talking about the Galilee or the Negev or Sinai. These are, I understand the feelings in Jewish hearts when people talk about Hebron and places like that. This is not just an ordinary city. It's in many ways more sacred and moving than most of the places in Israel now. So that's a very big thing to ask of people. And as I said, I think we're looking at a conflict where both sides have been asked to make big, superhuman decisions, and the fact is they're humans, so they don't do that. I think the other thing, though, is it's really helpful. It's really kind of essential for people to develop a narrative that looks forward rather than backward. If we cling to our pain, we won't get anywhere. And if we prefer wallowing in victimhood and the suffering of ourselves and our ancestors, we'll end up in one situation. And if we prefer the future of our children, you get in another situation. And so this is a narrative issue. So I think there is a potential narrative way out, but there's got to be hope. And right now, I think Israelis have no hope in the peaceful intention of Palestinians, and Palestinians have less than zero hope in the goodwill of Israelis to let them live as free equals in any way. So.
Hard words, and thank you for that response.
Without hope, it's very hard to make that shift.
Yeah. Understood. Can we have time for just a couple more?
Sure.
Micha Goodman, who's someone who a lot of us read and follow and so on.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the name. Yeah.
Okay. Just telling you that we are too. Okay, never mind. So Micha Goodman's writing about, in Catch 67, that was we even had a book club that read the book, and I think Micha actually addressed us about the book, also via Zoom, in the middle of COVID. The idea of shrinking the conflict, and Naftali Bennett talks about sometimes borrowing the words of Micha Goodman. Just, what is that for you?
Okay, I think from my perspective, it's very complicated. I think that what it tends to suggest is very good, right? Right now, what can we do? We can do things on the ground. Some of those things are reflected in Goodman's ideas about greater space, greater access less oppressive occupation, more freedom, more independence, in limited ways for Palestine. All that is very important. This is a situation of a pressure cooker that can blow up at any moment. And the main thing holding it back is the memory of the disaster of the Second Intifada, which was catastrophic for Palestinians. And enough people in the West Bank remember it that they say, no. Mass violence is just totally disastrous and we don't want anything to do with it. But eventually, generational change means that the memory fades and people become so hopeless that they start acting even irrationally, maybe. I mean, that's how people do sometimes. They say, all right, fine, that's it. We're going down. We take one with you, that kind of thing. That's Churchill's a phrase about a German invasion. You can always take one with you. That's the desperation phase, right? And I think it's very grim. So it's good that we haven't come back to that. But the danger here is the idea is the language, is the branding. I fear the branding because it does nothing to shrink the conflict. It doesn't change the conflict. It doesn't shrink the conflict. It manages the conflict. That's good. But if Israelis think they're shrinking the conflict, they're deluded. And that's my problem, is that, in other words, it may give Israelis a false sense that they're doing something that these measures cannot possibly do. So I like the ideas, but I find the branding extremely dangerous. Maybe if it's a way to sell it, okay, but if it really takes off as an idea, and then people end up saying, I thought we shrunk the conflict. Well, no, you didn't really change. I mean, you let people breathe a little more easily. That's all. The basic structures of the conflict are unchanged. So you didn't shrink it. You can't really shrink it. The only way to shrink it is to make a deal.
Thank you.
I mean, something like you could shrink it a bit by a major step to implement the rest of Oslo. If you really made a big change in area A, B, and C, you could reduce the conflict a bit. But no one's proposing that. Mm-hmm. I think that's right off the table. In fact, we're going in the opposite direction. We're going in the direction of annexation. So that's the exact opposite direction.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm of two minds, you see.
You made that very clear. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I'm going to... So again, some of the questions are somewhat repetitive of one another. So I'm going to try. And
sure.
Now it's coming up on 11 o'clock on the East Coast.
I can stay with you for a little bit. I feel comfortable enough that I could give you another 15 minutes if you wanted it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, now
up to
fogging up. Okay, how have Arab and particularly Palestinian views of ancient Jewish ties to the land changed over the years?
Very, very interesting question.
Yeah, it is. And there's more to it, but that's I think, an interesting nugget there. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I actually think this is a crucial question because I find that one of the most important, and a lot of Palestinians don't understand this, and they need to, is that the best way I've ever found to break through a skeptical Jewish or Israeli audience is to come right out and lead with an acknowledgement of Jewish history and Jewish attachment and the Jewish presence in the land historically, right? And just acknowledge it and say, we understand this. We get your relationship to this place. We're not sitting here saying you're outsiders, you're usurpers, etc. What's interesting is that was the initial take of the Arabs of Palestine, their leaders anyway, in the period between, say, 1897 and the mid-20s. That their idea, most of, if you read the letters and think correspondences, they say, yes, we understand your attachment here, but there's a people and you're going to start a huge war and it's going to be really problematic, so please don't do this because there's no way we can contain it, etc. But they usually led with that. The bitterness of the conflict led to a negation, really on both sides, of the legitimacy of the presence of the other, so that it became a received narrative among Palestinians and lots of Arabs that Jews came from Europe on a colonial mission sponsored by the West that was just about taking land and making a bastion, an outpost of the West in the Arab world and in the Islamic world. And it took on Cold War patina and Third Worldist patina and what have you. And so that the historicity of Jewish life in Palestine, ancient and modern, became sort of wiped away, right, and negated. And there was this sense among Palestinians, really a pathological sense, that if you admitted these historical facts, that you were undermining your own cause, which is going to be insane. And I think you have exactly the same kind of narrative on the Israeli side, where there's this notion that they're Johnny-come-latelys. Either they came in the 7th or 8th century, which is later than the biblical Hebrews, and we're the descendant of the biblical Hebrews, and nobody else is, and therefore, our rights are better than theirs. Or even more, that there was this sort of giant in-migration, the Joan Peters argument that keeps coming up again and again, that most of the Palestinians are recent migrants during the 20th century from other Arab countries who were flooding in to get jobs from Jewish immigrants. It's just crazy talk, ridiculous. And that in some way or another, Palestinians are the usurpers and they have no real rights. And besides, there are all these Arab countries, and why don't they just go and leave us alone and all that stuff? One Jewish country, 22 Arab countries, what's this? So there's this notion of the other as alien. I think in the past 15, 20 years, there's been a real erosion of those narratives on both sides. I think it's much harder to sell these ideas on both sides. It's become now really a trope of the Islamists more than anybody else, which is a significant but a small percentage of Palestinians, maybe 20%, 22%, not more than that, who really kind of buy into this stuff these days, I think. Or very old people, including people like Abu Mazen, some of the aged people who would tend to say things about, oh, there wasn't probably a temple there or something. He doesn't know what. He's not an archaeologist. He doesn't have a clue. He's just saying something obnoxious that his people, whatever, all this pandering garbage that politicians do. You don't really get that from younger people. And I think what's remarkable, if you want to bring in the Arabs, is the change in Arab perspectives, those who grew up after Oslo, right, especially in the Gulf, but even in the rest of the Arab world, who just look at Israel as another country in the Middle East. And they look at Jewish nationalism increasingly as another nationalism, right? There's various Arab nationalisms, there's Turkish nationalism, Kurdish nationalism, Persian nationalism in Iran, and Jewish nationalism in Israel. And sometimes it's useful, and sometimes it's bad, and sometimes it's good, and you work with it. It's not pathologized. It's not stigmatized. It's just another thing to deal with. It's seen as much as normal in a way that it never was from 1948 until, the millennium time, until the 2000s. And now it is, and you see that reflected in the Abraham Accords, in the different language coming out of Saudi Arabia, and in the different attitudes in many Arab countries. And there are still places like Lebanon where there's a lot of anger and a heavy concentration of pro-Iranian groups and others who are, and other states like Syria, which try to use this issue in a very inflammatory way. But I think culturally, the idea has been eroded. And that's a very good thing. I think on the Israeli side also, it's become very hard to sell the idea that these people are all just, a gang of Jordanians and Egyptians and Syrians who came running in, as soon as Tel Aviv was constructed to beg for jobs because they're so pathetic. I think there's enough of a sense of the real history that just doesn't fly with almost anyone in Israel, and increasingly very few Jewish Americans who were actually the real targets of that line anyway, more than Israelis, who I think always knew better than that.
And so I'll ask one last question, because we do want to spend a little bit of time just processing and digesting together.
No problem.
So I'll just say it. What about Hamas?
Yeah. Well, Hamas is a disaster. Hamas is an absolute disaster. Hamas is a function of a bunch of things. It's a function of the Islamist moment in the Arab world. It's very hard to get Palestinians to join the jihadist groups, like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and all that, because those groups disdain and negate nationalism. They want to destroy all the nations in the Arab and Islamic world and create some pan-Islamic something, right? And because Palestinians have never expressed their national identity, they fetishize and cherish it more than others do. It means more to them than people who've never expressed it. They felt it and they've never enjoyed it, and they really want it. And that includes the Islamists. So that, you get the Muslim Brotherhood, which can be a kind of weird mashup of patriotism and some kind of pan-Islamic distant dream of some kind, but it looks to be something. So there are people in Hamas who are Palestinians who happen to be Islamists, who are more nationalistic than Islamists and tend to be more pragmatic. And there are those who are Islamists who happen to be Palestinians who will not join groups like Al-Qaeda or something because they still have that Palestinian identity they can't detach from, but they do see themselves as part of a broader Muslim Brotherhood movement. They are a big problem because they outbid the PLO at every stage, right? And as long as the peace process fails, as long as there's no horizon for hope, they are able to get beyond the about 20%, I guess, of people who like their social agenda. But the thing about the Muslim Brotherhood is it's not really a political ideology. Whether they're in Egypt or in Tunisia or wherever it is, it doesn't have political content, right? There's no Islamic theory of taxation. There's no Islamic theory of climate change. There's no it doesn't tell you anything. This is a religion. What it tells you in their interpretation of it is a bunch of reactionary social mores, right? So it boils down to the politics of covering your hair and don't smoke and no alcohol and da-da-da-da-da. And are you related to that woman and who's that kind of stuff, very ultra conservative stuff that I'm sure you all recognize from parts of the Jewish community act much the same in their own ways, and at least in terms of how they order their social life, right? Very conservative. That's their agenda. They want to not practice that. They want to use the state or whatever power they can muster to enforce it. And that's the Muslim Brotherhood agenda. It's a social reactionary agenda wrapped in the patina of a political movement, but it doesn't really have political content because that's what they believe. What they fixate on is so-called moral issues, reactionary, conservative social values. And among Palestinians, those values, that anti-alcohol, anti-sort of sex misogynistic, very patriarchal, etc. ideas are popular to some extent in Gaza, a very large extent in Gaza, but not much elsewhere. A bit here and there, there's a constituency in Nablus and other places, but it's not very popular. I don't think it goes beyond 20, maybe 25%. So the challenge for Hamas is, how do you challenge the PLO and the PA for national leadership when your basic agenda is not that popular? And the answer from the beginning has been outbid them on nationalism, outbid them on violence, outbid them on armed struggle. Say you're never going to agree to anything, and you denounce Oslo, and you denounce the recognition of Israel, and you denounce this and that, and you always outbid. And then you outbid each other. And then you have smaller groups like Islamic Jihad, which is even more extreme, aligned with, openly and entirely aligned with Iran, not partially like Hamas, but entirely aligned with Iran, not for religious reasons, but for reasons of radicalism, and which is simply a violent organization, doesn't even have a political, so you get more and more extreme. Without the conflict, Hamas is fairly small, right? Hamas's big moment when it became a competitor was the Second Intifada, when you had this gigantic militarized conflagration with very large number of casualties on both sides, mainly civilians, a lot more Palestinians than Israelis, but thousands of Israelis too. And Hamas was more extreme than the PLO. And the PLO had to create this Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade and start trafficking in religious rhetoric that was alien to their own ideology and history in order to compete with these people, to be more violent than they were inclined to be, to compete with these people, and to not get outbid in the way that Hamas was trying to outbid them. And as long, at every stage, they have intervened to try to stop agreements when they could happen. And it's very important for them that progress towards coexistence and peace does not happen, because the only way for them to get, let me make a dictum here. The reason people create political parties is to gain power, and they want power in their local area first, right? Even wings of political parties it's the left wing of the Democratic Party, the right wing of the Republican Party, are just trying to overthrow mainly their own senators to take over the party. This is how politics works, right? And so Hamas's goal, really, anything to do with Israel is secondary or tertiary. Their main goal is to take over Area A from the PLO and to take over the authority of the PLO from within and get into the PLO and change its policies and take power. And then after that, they'll see. So they've split the Palestinian national movement. They've created a pressure for non-cooperation and non-agreement, and they've indulged in incredibly bloodthirsty and really stupid, wicked violence for a long time, and they've done an immense amount of harm. The good thing is that they have not become the dominant force yet among Palestinians, and they have a lot of problems of their own. And the other good thing is that, I think the whole Islamist moment in the Arab world is kind of fading, and it holds on in Gaza mainly because of the situation there. And a lot of people thought when the Arab Spring unleashed uprisings against a number of dictators that there would be an Islamist wave, because most Arabs are devout Muslims, therefore they're going to be Islamists. If you let them vote, they'll vote for the Islamists. We have seen in every single case that's not the case. No, they won initial elections for reasons of competitive advantage that can't be replicated in an immediate post-dictatorship environment. But after that, no. So I think it's pretty clear that they don't have the solution and that they don't have the majority anywhere, not even in Egypt, not at all. And I think, again, the reason that the Islamists, the Brotherhood, holds on in Gaza is precisely because of the occupation and the conflict. And that's what they thrive on. And I would say one final thing about Hamas. If there were an agreement or a major step towards a two-state agreement, Hamas would split. It would split into at least two, and I think probably three. And the main split would be between those who are mainly Palestinians who happen to be Islamists who would want to join and get power through various means, to get power in that entity, as they have in Gaza. And they would have to participate. And those who are mainly Islamists who happen to be Palestinians who would want to not do that and keep fighting and say this is not good enough and we reject it, blah, blah, blah. There would probably be even other splits than that. But I don't think Hamas, as it currently is, this coalition that exists now, could survive any kind of two-state solution or major step towards a two-state solution. That's my view.
Okay. So first and foremost, we'd like to express our thanks for your being with us tonight.
Sure.
And there's no question that we have both learned a lot and have had the opportunity to cook up additional thoughts that will carry us forward, certainly between now and the second session, and probably well beyond. So thank you.
Great.
I hope that our paths continue to cross in other ways. And we're going to take a few minutes kind of on our own now, just to process what we heard. And have a wonderul rest of the night.
I wish you good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
I'm going to sleep.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, I didn't want to, we don't have a lot of processing time, but I, tried to take advantage as much as we could, of hearing, what he had to say, because he certainly had quite a way of saying it. But if anyone in